morning. Welcome to The Man Who Would Be Knight. Today we're going to be talking about the Barefoot Warm-Up. This is one of my go-to routines. I designed it to be kind of a one-stop shop for warming up, for priming all of the muscles, basically everything from rib cage on down to my toes. It doesn't really do anything for your shoulders. I found that my shoulders, they kind of warm themselves up. Some light push-ups, some pull-ups, stuff like that, they're good to go. But everything from here down requires a little bit more focused attention. So I've designed this routine. None of the individual exercises are original. You can find all of them anywhere else on the internet. YouTube is full of them. I just cobbled them together to form a routine that works for me. It takes about 10 to 15 minutes. I'm going to show you each of the exercises in turn, and we're going to talk about a couple of little pointers about how to do them correctly. I will say, to start this out, throughout this entire process, I try to do it with a braced abdomen. What that means is I expand my stomach. Take a deep breath in, breathe from my stomach, and then close my glottis like this and tighten up my abs. And what that does is it forms this wall. It's a braced wall around my entire abdomen, all the way into my back. And I'll do another video about bracing the core, proper core bracing. It's kind of foundational to pretty much every movement. But for now, just know that I'm doing all of this with a tight core, or a braced core, which is not exactly the same thing as a tight core. And that's what makes it a workout for a priming movement for all of these muscles. If I were to do it without that braced core, then it would kind of be, one, it would be a little bit hard on my lower back, and two, it would not fully adequately prime all of these muscles. So, braced core, and then we're going to start with a tabletop to scale maneuver. So what this looks like is I stand like this, I'm going to bend down, I'm pivoting at the hip, I'm not bending forward like this, I'm pivoting at the hip, maintaining activation in my glutes, and I'm going to come down into a tabletop position, and then I'm going to come back up, and the same leg that was raised to the rear, I'm going to raise straight to the front as high as I can. Then I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. A couple of pointers about this. You're going to want to maintain glute tension throughout. So obviously core tension goes without saying, because otherwise you're just going to flop over like a wet noodle. But glute tension is a little bit harder to understand. Once you get the hang of it, it's pretty straightforward. But until you actually get a feel for it, you may be wondering what exactly that means. That means that as I'm pivoting on my left hip. My left hip is the one that's going to bend, but my right hip, my right glute has to be engaged. And essentially, this is what glute engagement looks like. I just fire this glute muscle right here, lock myself into a straight position. And then as I bend forward, I'm maintaining that glute activation until I feel this stretch in this hamstring on my left side. I can go as low as I want, but I'm trying to maintain a more or less straight line between my shoulder and my heel, exactly as it would if I were standing up. And the same thing is true as I'm raising this right leg. I'm trying to activate this other glute so that, because if I don't, center of gravity being what it is, I'm going to tend to bend forward as I lift. And I don't want to do that. I want to maintain this upright posture and at the same time lift this leg as high as I can. And that's where hip flexors, my hip flexors don't have a great range of motion because they're being limited by the antagonizing muscle groups in my posterior chain. Basically, hamstrings, calves, glutes are all tight. That's fine as far as this range of motion goes. Basically, if you can get to 90 degrees with both knees locked and under control, that's a pretty good functional level of maneuver for most people. If you want to go higher for like the super high kicks, that's going to require some dedicated training. This is just a warm-up maneuver. And I just do 10 on each side. try to do it with as much control as possible. And I call this the barefoot warm-up because initially I was doing it in bare feet, but I added some exercises that really work better with shoes. But if you can do it in bare feet, it works a lot. It's even better because now you have your feet in contact with the ground and you're training some proprioception. So after I do my 10 tabletop to scale on each side, then I'm going to do lateral leg raises. A lateral leg raise is very simple. I simply raise my leg laterally. What I'm trying to do at this one is activate the glute minimus and all these abductor muscles of the hip. Piriformis, glute minimus are probably the two major ones. But I'm not trying to bend over like this and just lever my leg up. I'm trying to stand as upright as possible. Obviously, I'm going to have to shift my center of gravity a little bit over my stationary foot in order to prevent myself from toppling over. But I just want to kind of lean just a little bit, shift over, and I'm still maintaining a straight core. I'm just leaning a little bit on this hip. So here's the difference. This is leaning with my spine. This is flexing of the hip. And that's all I need to do in order to raise this leg. I'm going to raise it as high as I can, which is not very high. I'm not a taekwondo artist or a ballerina. And then I do the same thing on the other side. And I should feel the tension here in the outside of my glutes. So basically right here and right here. Those muscles are, they take a lot of training. And if you're getting into it in your 30s, you're probably never going to be Jean-Claude Van Damme. And I just do 10 on each side. It's very simple. Next, I'm going to do my deep squat pivots. I squat down as deep as I can. I keep both of my heels on the ground, and this is my starting position. If you view my starting position from the side, you'll notice that my back is flat. I'm not hunched over like this. I'm not rounding it, not flexing it, but I'm also not hyperextending it like this. That would tend to force my heels off the ground. Instead, I want a nice neutral spine. I want both my heels on the ground as close as possible. From that position, I'm going to rotate, and I'm going to try and touch this knee to the ground while keeping this heel on the ground pointed at a 90-degree angle. What this is doing is the rectus femoris is the prime hip flexor per se. It's the muscle that I think of when I think of the hip flexor group. What is interesting about the rectus femoris is that it actually attaches here, but it originates up here at the top of my hip. So unlike the rest of my quad group, which starts down here and really anchors from there, and all it does is extend the knee, the rectus femoris anchors up here. So when it contracts, not only does it extend the knee, it also flexes the hip. So when we're doing our scale, that is straight up rectus femoris all day long. The problem is, in America, most people spend a lot of time sitting, and watch what happens when I sit. I shorten up that angle between here and here, between the top of my hip and the front of my knee. That shortens up. I spend a lot of time sitting. It spends a lot of time in the shortened state and not a lot of time in the elongated state, which is where it needs to be when I'm standing upright. So in order to, and what this does, for those who don't know, is it rotates my hips anteriorly, which causes me, in order to stand upright, to have to put a lot of tension, hyperextending my lower back, which uses all these muscles in the lower back region right here. That is a prime cause of a lot of low back pain. I see it daily in clinic. So I'm trying to prevent that by stretching out this hip flexor. And we'll be doing several of these stretches, but for right now, this one The way the stretch works is from my deep squatted position, this is about as short as your hip flexors could ever be, unless I straightened my knees and just really bent over like that. But this is about as short as your hip flexors get. But now I'm going to drop this knee all the way to the ground, and I'm keeping my core engaged. I'm trying to lean back and pull on this hip flex, on this rectus femoris. I'm trying to open it out. And then I'm going to switch over while maintaining my balance. So I'm not supporting myself with my hands. And I'm going to rotate over and do the same thing on the other side. And I'm driving my hips forward a little bit as I do it. Then back up. This does a couple of things. We've already talked about opening out that hip flexor. It's also opening out this adductor group, adductor group. They're the ones that pull your legs together. This exercise is opening them out and giving them a good stretch. It's working the proprioception to maintain knees and toes oriented in the same direction, no matter which way my hips are oriented. So my knees and toes are supposed to be moving as a unit. What that means is, a lot of people when they're in a deep squat, they cannot squat with their knees pointed outwards because of some kind of limiting mobility, usually weak glute medius and glute minimus, and sometimes a tight adductor group. But what they'll end up looking like is toes pointing out at this angle, knees pointing in at a slightly tighter angle. Another variation would be the opposite, with toes pointing in, knees pointing out. So you can see my toes are pointing towards the camera, my knees are pointing out towards the wall. All of these are less than ideal from a knee health perspective. The knee has a certain amount of rotation built into the joint, but it's not designed to bear loads at extremes of flexion while it's twisted. So in order for optimal knee health, you want your knees and your toes to point in the same direction no matter which way they're pointing. And you'll see this in martial artists, you'll see this in wrestlers. When they go to shoot, they'll turn their knee and their toes both in the same direction, and now they have a lot more power to push off than if they were trying to push off like this, with the knee pointed slightly forward and the toe pointed outward. Better knee health, less risk of injury, and that's kind of another thing that we're working in this particular move. So it seems pretty simple, a lot going on. Touch my knee, come over, touch my knee. And that's all there is to it. I just do 10 on each side. I'm kind of boring like that. Next, the moneymaker, the ATG, which stands for butt to ground lunge. Also, I think there's a guy on YouTube called Knees Over Toes Guys. He's a Knees Over Toes guy who's a very big proponent of this, and I think ATG is also his something athletic training group. Anyway, if it is, no copyright infringement intended. I'm just saying I call it the butt to ground lunge, because unlike a normal lunge where I'm stopping with my knee, my shin parallel, and dropping from there, an ATG lunge, I'm driving my knees as far forward as possible while keeping my heel on the ground, and I'm trying to drop my butt, my hips, as low as possible to the ground. So what that looks like from the side, I'm going to step forward, I'm going to lower down, and I'm trying to keep this knee off the ground as much as possible by firing this glute as hard as I can. I'm firing this glute and trying to lift this knee up while at the same time driving forward and trying to open out this hip flexor right here. This is where core engagement is very important. I don't want to be arching my back. I don't want to be slumping forward like this. I want to be as upright as possible. And then I drive back up into the standing position. You can do this a couple of different ways. You can do it as a walking lunge. And what a walking lunge means is that when I step out of it, I'm stepping forward. You can do it as a stationary lunge where when I step out of it, I step back into my original position. Here's the difference. This is the walking lunge, drop into it, and then I would step forward and do it with my other leg. Stationary lunge, better in my garage because I only have a certain amount of space. Stepping into it, dropping down, pushing right back out of it. Switch legs. And I just do 10 on each side. Again, I want to reiterate, core tension is very important to prevent this hyperextending of the lower back and putting all this kind of stress on these erector spinae muscles. All the erectors of the spine are powerful muscles, they're postural muscles, but they're small muscles. And they can get really cranky with you really fast. Whereas if I'm bracing with my core, now all of that activation is coming from my core, and my hips and my abdomen are keeping me upright as much as possible. After I do 10 on each side of those, I do lateral lunges or lateral squats. The difference is pretty minimal. With a lateral lunge, I'm starting with my feet together. I step to the side, drop into that lunge, and then I step back to my feet together. That's a lateral lunge. A lateral squat, I start with my feet to the side, apart, and I just drop, come back down to here, and then drop to the other side. That's lateral squat. That's lateral lunge. So this one, a couple of pointers on this. I'm trying to open out my hips and keep my nose, my toes and my knees pointed in the same directions. I'm also trying to improve my balance. What I mean by that is, if I drop down into this lateral lunge position, I want my heels to be touching the ground or as close to it as possible. In order to do that, while maintaining an upright spine, I have to extend my arms quite a bit forward to kind of counterbalance. If I don't, my hips are behind my heels, I just fall straight backwards. In order to maintain this balance, I have to maintain that bracing of my posture all the way through the whole range of motion. And my right ankle is not as flexible as my left ankle, so my right heel invariably comes off the ground in the bottom couple inches of the movement. And now it's back on the ground, and I'm driving myself up. Again, this is working the glutes and the quads slightly, but it's putting a lot of emphasis on this abductor group, because I'm trying to push my leg out at an angle off of my midline. Still maintaining that tight core to transfer power efficiently into my torso in case I'm doing some kind of work like, I don't know, like a wrestling shoot or something like that. Or there's a bunch of different applications for it. And then we move into the Nordic Curl. I do 10 on each side of that, then we move into the Nordic Curl. For the Nordic Curl, you're gonna need something to hook your feet under. I have this post here with two 2x4s attached to the ends of it, and something to put your knees on, unless you're super hardcore and you want to grind your knees into oblivion. So the Nordic Curl is the most difficult of all of these exercises. So I'm going to show you that, and then I'm going to show you an easier maneuver that you can do. With the Nordic Curl, I'm going to hook my feet on these 2x4s here. I'm not strong enough to start from scratch yet, so I'm going to give myself a little push. And I'm engaging my hamstrings and pulling myself up. I lower myself down and I pull myself up. The full-on hardcore, the hardest variation is to not use your hands, obviously, but not to allow any flexion at the hip. So this is flexion at the hip. And at the moment I allow a little bit of flexion, I am taking some of my hamstring out of the equation. I'm bringing my weight closer to the fulcrum, shortening up the lever arm, making it an easier maneuver. So if I were to do it like this, with my knees, with my hips bent, I would be able to do it quite efficiently. But I'm trying to strengthen, I'm trying to get stronger, so I'm trying to drive my hips as far forward as possible by engaging my glutes and do this as much as possible, moving my whole body weight. And I just do 10 of those. If that is too powerful or too hard for me, the alternate is to use an elastic band like this. Try this a little bit further away. Hook my heels in it. And then I'm going to pull my heels towards my butt. Not this exactly the same range of motion, but it does effectively put some tension on those hamstrings. Why hamstrings? Because the hamstrings are a major antagonist of the hip flexors. So hamstrings help to pull your hips underneath you. You want your hips underneath you and in line with your shoulders and your heels. Remember I talked about that tight hip flexor syndrome from sitting all day long. Most people by corollary have weak hamstrings. Then move into the calf raises. The easy variation, you start on the box like this and you just, with locked knees, engaged glutes, engaged core, I'm just going to drive myself up into the air. I'm using both of my feet at the same time, so each foot is only pushing about half my body weight. If I were to take one foot out of the equation, now I have a much more challenging move. And you just use one or the other depending on your ability level. If you do it with a bent knee, it's going to become a lot easier, but it is not going to engage that posterior chain as effectively. After I do 10 on each side of those, the final movement of this series is the tib raise, the tibialis raise. This one's a little tricky to visualize, but I'm standing on the box with just the very back of my heel on the edge of the box. This is why I'm wearing shoes for this barefoot warm-up. And when I lower my toes to the ground, I'm lowering my whole body. When I raise my toes up, I raise my whole body. This is a tibialis raise. I could do the same thing. They have machines at the gym where you can do the same thing with your feet seated. You just hook your toes under something and you lift up a weight like this. I could do the same thing with my stretch band here. Just hook it over my toes. And now I'm doing the exact same movement. Either way, whichever way you do it, doesn't really matter. What you're trying to do is tighten up and strengthen these tibialis anterior muscles right here on the outside of your shin. They're the muscles that pull up like this. There's a number, it seems like kind of a funky niche thing to do. There's a couple of reasons for that. One, tibialis anterior also stabilizes at the knee. It helps with that knee-toe alignment that we were talking about. The other, and perhaps a little less intuitively, is deceleration. When I was in the Army, some of our personal trainers would tell us that deceleration is where most injuries occur in sports. It's not accelerating into the sprint that hurts people, it's decelerating out of it. So when we work this tibialis anterior, we are assisting in this deceleration process. How? As I'm trying to slow, let's say I'm running at full speed and I'm trying to slow down. I slow down by putting my foot in front of me and basically striking my heel on the ground. With a weak tibialis, my foot just flops and I end up flat-footing it like this. Just a kind of a flop. And that transfers all this energy directly up my leg into my spine. With a strong tib anterior, my toe is flexed, plantar or is dorsiflexed towards my knee, and when I hit, it's rolling forward. You see the difference between flopping and rolling, and it's the tibialis anterior that allows it to do that rolling maneuver. Some of that force is going to force that foot into plantar flexion. If I'm really trying to slow down, some of it is going to force that tib anterior, is going to pull like harder than that can pull. And it's going to force that foot into plantar flexion so that the sole of the foot hits the ground. That's fine. As it's doing that, as it's forcing it to open out there, it's taking up some of that energy. Some of that energy is being absorbed by this muscle rather than being transferred up into your spine. And then fast feet, where you are moving your feet, turning them over really, really fast, multiplies that, that force reduction. But the key to that is being able to plant the heel and plant it strongly enough so that it's not just going to flop, and you're going to be able to control that forward or that deceleration. So, does it apply to everybody? No. But it does help stabilize the knees. And if you ever do find yourself in a situation where, I don't know, you're stepping out into traffic and there's a bus coming in, then you're trying to push yourself backwards, it's going to come in handy. That's all there is to the barefoot warm-up. It's those exercises. I spent a lot of time talking about each one. Maybe tomorrow I'll make a video of just going through the whole routine without any explanation of any of the moves. Hope you enjoyed.